The United States is pausing a long-standing joint Canada-U.S. military board. That's according to the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense, who says Canada has failed to make credible progress on its defense commitments.
The Pentagon's decision to suspend a historic U.S.-Canada Defense Coordination Board was supposed to send a message of strength. Instead, it may have exposed something far more dangerous for Washington. Because after years of pressuring Canada to spend more on defense, the Trump administration is now escalating tensions with Ottawa, even after Prime Minister Mark Carney pushed Canada beyond NATO spending targets ahead of schedule. And that creates a serious strategic question. If even Canada, America's closest military and economic partner, is no longer treated as a stable ally under Trump's pressure-first approach, then what exactly is happening to the Western alliance system itself? That is why this story matters far beyond one military board. This is about trust, predictability, and whether the United States is quietly weakening its own position inside the alliances that made it globally dominant in the first place.
This week, the U.S. Department of Defense confirmed it is pausing participation in the Permanent Joint Board on Defense with Canada, a bilateral military coordination body that has existed since 1940. The forum was originally established during World War II to strengthen North American defense planning and later became deeply connected to broader military coordination through NORAD, Arctic surveillance, aerospace defense, and continental security planning. The move was announced by U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby, who argued that Washington needed to reassess how the forum benefits American strategic interests. The Trump administration also claimed Canada had failed to make credible progress on defense commitments. But that explanation immediately triggered backlash in Canada for one simple reason. Canada has already dramatically increased defense spending under Mark Carney's government. Earlier this year, Ottawa confirmed Canada had reached NATO's 2% defense spending benchmark years ahead of schedule. Canada also unveiled major Arctic security investments worth roughly $35 billion, while committing nearly $39 billion toward NORAD modernization over the coming years. In practical terms, Canada already responded to Washington's long-standing demands. Yet instead of stabilizing relations, the Trump administration escalated again. And that is precisely why this story is beginning to resonate far beyond Canada itself.
The United States remains the world's largest military power, but global influence is not built on military size alone. It is built on alliances that function because allies believe Washington is ultimately predictable, rational, and strategically consistent. That predictability is now increasingly under pressure. The problem for the Trump administration is not simply that it paused one military coordination forum with Canada. The deeper issue is the growing perception that alliances under Trump are becoming conditional, transactional, and politically unstable. And Canada may be the most important test case of all. Canada is not a marginal partner. The two countries share the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, with roughly $3.6 billion crossing the border every single day. Their defense systems are deeply integrated through NORAD. Their aerospace industries, energy systems, critical mineral supply chains, and Arctic defense infrastructure are heavily interconnected. If even this relationship begins showing structural distrust, then other allies are inevitably paying attention. Because the message becomes difficult to ignore. If Canada can be pressured this aggressively after increasing military spending, then no ally is truly insulated from political leverage anymore.
The irony is becoming increasingly obvious. Trump likely views pressure as a negotiation tool designed to force greater alignment from allies. But strategically, the policy may be accelerating long-term diversification away from the United States instead. Canada's political establishment increasingly appears to be drawing one central conclusion from Trump's second term. Dependence on Washington now carries growing strategic risk. That shift is already visible economically. The share of Canadian exports going to the United States has gradually declined as Ottawa expands relationships with Europe and Asia. Canada has strengthened trade coordination with Indo-Pacific economies, deepened industrial cooperation with South Korea, and accelerated efforts to secure alternative supply chains for energy, defense manufacturing, and critical minerals. Now the same logic is beginning to influence defense policy. Canada has expanded Arctic security cooperation with Nordic countries, including Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. Ottawa is also investing heavily in domestic Arctic surveillance systems, military mobility infrastructure, and northern sovereignty projects, because Canadian policymakers increasingly believe that over-reliance on Washington creates long-term vulnerability. And this may ultimately become the biggest strategic backfire for the United States, because Washington's pressure campaign is not making Canada more dependent. It is encouraging Canada to become more autonomous. This matters even more because the Arctic is no longer a secondary geopolitical theater. It is rapidly becoming one of the most important strategic regions on Earth. The Arctic affects missile defense systems, naval positioning, rare earth minerals, future shipping corridors, energy development, and long-range military logistics. Russia continues expanding Arctic militarization. China is increasing polar activity and infrastructure investment. NATO planners increasingly view the region as critical to future continental defense architecture. And in the middle of this strategic transition, Washington is injecting instability into its own closest continental partnership. That may create short-term political optics for Trump domestically, but from a long-term strategic perspective, it creates friction precisely where North American coordination should be strengthening. Military alliances are ultimately held together by confidence and continuity. Once allies begin questioning whether defense relationships are becoming tools of political pressure, the incentive structure changes. Countries begin hedging. They diversify suppliers. They build domestic capacity. They reduce dependency gradually and quietly over time. Canada now appears to be entering exactly that phase. Mark Carney's response has been notably disciplined. Rather than escalating emotionally, Ottawa appears focused on long-term positioning. Canada is simultaneously increasing defense spending, modernizing NORAD participation, strengthening Arctic sovereignty, expanding Indo-Pacific trade, and developing broader industrial independence from U.S. political cycles. That approach may prove more strategically effective than direct confrontation, because Canada's leverage is not based on dramatic retaliation. It is based on structural importance. The United States still depends heavily on Canadian energy, uranium, aluminum, critical minerals, aerospace integration, and Arctic geography. Canada remains one of America's most reliable economic and military partners, precisely because the relationship has historically been stable and deeply institutionalized. But stability works both ways. If Washington increasingly treats alliances as transactional leverage systems, then Ottawa has every incentive to reduce future exposure wherever possible. And ironically, that may become one of the defining geopolitical consequences of Trump's second term. Trump likely intended this move to demonstrate control. Instead, it may be revealing something else entirely. The United States is discovering that pressure can create distance just as easily as compliance. Because when even Canada begins accelerating military autonomy, Arctic independence, and strategic diversification, the problem is no longer just bilateral tension. It becomes a warning sign for the broader Western alliance structure itself. And that may be the deeper story emerging here. Not that America is becoming weaker militarily, but that under Trump, America may be becoming harder for allies to fully trust strategically. And once trust inside an alliance system starts eroding, rebuilding it is often far more expensive than destroying it in the first place.
Carney responds to Trump's governor remark with something far more powerful than a counterpunch. He responds with facts and with a calm, structured explanation that quietly dismantles the narrative Donald Trump tried to build around Canada's new arrangement with China. While Trump threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods and accused Canada of becoming a drop-off port for Beijing, both Ottawa and Beijing stated clearly that the agreement does not target the United States at all. And that is where the story turns. Because the more the details come into focus, the more Trump's threat looks less like strategy and more like volatility pushing allies away. This isn't simply a dispute over canola tariffs or electric vehicle duties. It's a window into how the United States is reshaping its relationships through unpredictable bursts of pressure, and how Canada is choosing to navigate around that instability.
Since your speech in Davos, we've had Donald Trump threaten fresh tariffs on Canada if we cut a deal with China. He started calling you governor, like you did your predecessor. I'd like to know what you think about all that and what impact you think your speech had on Canada-U.S. relations.
In fact, I think Canada understood the scale of the change in U.S. Trade policy, what it meant for our economy. We understood that well before other countries, and we started to react, controlling what we can control, building it at home, and very importantly, diversifying our trade partners abroad.
The sequence began with Trump calling Carney the governor of Canada, a dismissive jab meant to frame Canada as subordinate to Washington. Hours later, he escalated sharply, warning he would impose a 100% tariff on Canadian imports if Ottawa made a deal with China. In Trump's telling, China was successfully taking over Canada, and the agreement between Ottawa and Beijing was a threat to U.S. national security. Carney's response came carefully and methodically. He explained that Canada is not signing a free trade agreement with China. There was never any proposal for one. Instead, the two countries agreed to resolve long-standing tariff disputes. China will lower its punitive 85% tariff on Canadian canola oil down to 15% by March. Canada will apply a standard MFN tariff, 6.1%, on a limited number of Chinese electric vehicles, instead of the temporary 100% duty imposed last year. There is no preferential access, no backdoor route into the U.S. market, and no violation of North America's trade pact. China publicly reinforced the point, stating that the arrangement does not target any third party. Meanwhile, Carney reminded reporters that any genuine free trade deal with a non-market economy would require Canada to formally notify the United States under USMCA. Ottawa had already communicated the nature of the discussions to American officials. By the time the dust settled, even Washington's own senior officials were clarifying Trump's threat, saying the 100% tariff would apply only if Canada allowed Chinese dumping into the U.S. market. That clarification, coming so quickly after Trump's statement, revealed how wide the gap has become between presidential rhetoric and actual policy.
Trump's move follows a now familiar pattern. He reacts first without waiting for confirmed details and constructs a narrative of betrayal or threat that later collapses under scrutiny. In this case, he objected fiercely to an agreement that, according to both participating countries, has nothing to do with undermining the United States. Only days earlier, Trump had said he viewed a Canada-China deal as a good thing. The contradiction underscores how quickly his positions can shift and how difficult it has become for partners to anticipate Washington's posture from one week to the next. For allies, that unpredictability carries costs. It forces governments to hedge, diversify, and build buffers against sudden U.S. policy swings. And it reinforces an uncomfortable truth. Reliance on the United States now requires constant protection from the United States.
Carney highlighted that Canada recognized this shift months ago. The U.S. trade environment had changed, and Canada needed to prepare accordingly. That preparation included a broad sweep of new agreements, 12 of them, spanning Asia, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. The goal was simple: stabilize Canadian trade by expanding beyond a single dominant partner. The episode with China reinforces why that decision was not only strategic but necessary. By articulating Canada's approach without theatrics, Carney positioned Ottawa as the stable actor in a moment defined by American volatility. For many partners around the world, that distinction matters. Markets responded to Trump's threat with immediate flight to safe haven assets. Investors, governments, and suppliers saw a familiar pattern: the United States destabilizing its own economic environment and expecting others to shoulder the fallout.
Beijing's tone was notably restrained. Its statement emphasized mutual benefit, clear interests, and non-interference in third-party relations. Whether the language was diplomatic or strategic, it directly contradicted Trump's claim that China is using Canada to infiltrate the U.S. market. Without evidence of such a plan, and with Canada applying transparent, WTO-consistent tariffs, Trump's warning looks more symbolic than substantive. The mismatch between Trump's accusation and the facts leaves the U.S. exposed. If both parties to the agreement say it has nothing to do with America, then the motivation behind the 100% tariff threat appears less like national security and more like a negotiating tactic pushed to an extreme.
What stands out most is the contrast in leadership styles. Carney underlined Canada's commitments to Arctic security, USMCA obligations, and transparent trade diversification. He framed the China arrangement as a technical resolution of tariff disputes and declined to react to every emotional outburst. This is the posture of a government attempting to lower the temperature and widen its strategic options. Trump's posture does the opposite. The threat itself, rather than the content, becomes the story. And when the story is a threat without a factual basis, the United States risks alienating even those who have historically aligned closely with it. This erosion of trust is not theatrical. It has material consequences in upcoming USMCA negotiations, where Canada now has stronger justification for insisting on greater predictability and clearer rules of engagement. Trump's 100% tariff threat was meant to intimidate. Instead, it validated Canada's long-term strategy. When a country is told that any independent trade action could trigger extreme retaliation, the rational response is not obedience, it is diversification. Canada is already moving in that direction. Other partners are doing the same, and in that sense, the threat backfired instantly. This moment exposes a broader trend. The United States is no longer the predictable anchor of North American stability. When its policies shift from day to day and its own officials contradict each other within hours, allies adapt by building parallel networks of trade and security. Canada's arrangement with China, modest as it is, slots into that picture naturally.
We're focused on results for Canadians. We're working through parliaments to get results for Canadians. We are securing trade deals around the world for Canadians, for the future of Canadians. And all of that builds our strength here at home, provides more opportunities, makes us less dependent on the United States.
Trump intended to pressure Canada. What he actually did was underline the reason Canada is expanding its partnerships. Ottawa now has a straightforward case to make on the world stage. A middle power must protect itself from the unpredictability of great power politics, even when that unpredictability comes from its closest neighbor. As the USMCA review approaches, the stakes are rising. The question for Washington is whether it wants a North American partner or a North American subordinate. And the question for Canada is whether this is simply another tariff threat or the moment the country steps further out of America's shadow.